The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Pinewood, a small southern town. The air hung heavy with the lingering heat of the day. But for Mrs. Alma Jackson, the oppressive warmth was the least of her worries. Her son, James, lay at home feverish and struggling to breathe. The doctor's hurried visit earlier had yielded a prescription for the medicine that could save him. But it came with an urgency that was now driving Alma into unfamiliar territory, Blake's pharmacy. A place she had long avoided. Mrs. Jackson, a woman in her late 60s with skin weathered by years of hard work and eyes that spoke of both wisdom and pain, had grown up knowing her place in the deeply segregated society of Pinewood. The unwritten rules were clear. The black community lived on one side of town and rarely ventured beyond it unless absolutely necessary. Tonight, Alma had no choice. Her son's life depended on it. She adjusted the scarf over her graying hair and clutched the folded prescription tightly in her hand as she stepped onto the cracked sidewalk leading to Blake's pharmacy. The storefront's bright neon sign flickered against the dusky sky, its light spilling onto the pavement. She paused for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard stories about Mr. Edward Blake, the proprietor, a man known not only for his pharmaceutical knowledge but for his unwavering disdain for the black community. Still, James needed her to be brave. As Alma pushed open the glass door, a small bell jingled above her, signaling her arrival. The scent of antiseptics and old wood filled her nostrils. The store was quiet except for the faint hum of a ceiling fan and the rustle of Mr. Blake shuffling papers behind the counter. He looked up, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as they landed on Alma. His tall frame stiffened, and his lips curled into a sneer. "What do you want?" he barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Alma swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Good evening, sir. I have a prescription for my son," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she unfolded the paper and placed it on the counter. Mr. Blake snatched the prescription and scanned it quickly before throwing it back at her as though it were contaminated. "We don't serve your kind here," he said coldly, his disdain dripping from every word. Alma's breath caught in her throat. "Sir, please, my son is very sick. The doctor said he needs this medicine right away. I'll pay." "I don't care what the doctor said," Blake interrupted, slamming his hand on the counter. "Take your money and your problems somewhere else. I'm not risking my business catering to people like you." The words stung like a slap. But Alma stood her ground. Her son's life was at stake. "Please, Mr. Blake," she said, her voice cracking as desperation seeped through her resolve. "He's just a child. He's done nothing to you." Blake leaned forward, his face inches from hers, his tone dripping with malice. "Get out of my store before I call the sheriff. You people don't belong here." The room seemed to close in around Alma. Her pulse thundered in her ears. But she refused to let the tears welling in her eyes fall. She backed away slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Blake's hateful glare followed her every step until she reached the door. She turned one last time, hoping for a sliver of compassion. But his expression remained hard and unyielding. When Alma stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her like a wave, but it did nothing to soothe the burning shame and helplessness that consumed her. She sank onto a nearby bench, her hands covering her face as the tears finally came. In that moment, she felt the weight of every injustice she had endured in her life, every door slammed in her face, every insult hurled her way, every opportunity denied simply because of the color of her skin. But this was different. This was her son's life. Gathering her strength, Alma stood and began the long walk home. The streets were eerily quiet, the world seemingly oblivious to the battle raging within her. As she approached her modest house, she saw the faint light flickering in James's room and quickened her pace. Inside, her neighbor, Mrs. Clara Bell, was sitting by James's bedside, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. "How did it go, Alma?" Clara asked, her expression hopeful but wary. Alma shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He wouldn't sell it to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wouldn't even listen." Clara's face darkened with anger, but she placed a comforting hand on Alma's shoulder. "We'll figure this out," she said firmly. "We're not going to let him get away with this." That night, as Alma sat by her son's bedside, listening to his labored breathing, a spark of resolve began to grow within her. She thought of all the times she had accepted injustice as a part of life. All the moments when she had swallowed her pride and moved on for the sake of survival. This time, she decided, would be different. She wouldn't let Mr. Blake's hatred go unanswered, not when James's life hung in the balance. The next morning, Clara introduced Alma to Ms. Clara Richards, a prominent civil rights activist who had recently moved to Pinewood to organize grassroots efforts against racial discrimination. Alma hesitated at first, afraid of drawing more trouble to her family. But Clara Richards's passion was infectious. "This isn't just about you, Mrs. Jackson," Clara said, her voice steady and determined. "It's about all of us. If we don't stand up to people like Blake, they'll keep doing this, hurting us, humiliating us, denying us what's rightfully ours." Alma nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. For James, for every other mother who might one day stand where she had stood, she would fight. And so, the first seeds of resistance were sown. Alma sat on the edge of her son James's bed, the frail boy's shallow breathing filling the silence of their small home. The single lamp on the bedside table cast a dim glow, its light barely touching the peeling wallpaper and worn furniture that bore testament to years of struggle. James's face was pale, his usually bright eyes closed in restless sleep. Every weak rise and fall of his chest felt like a countdown, a ticking clock that tightened Alma's chest with fear. She ran a trembling hand over James's damp forehead, whispering softly, "Hold on, baby. Mama's gonna make this right." The doctor's words replayed in her mind. "Get this medicine as soon as possible. He doesn't have much time." Alma had promised herself she would do whatever it took. But she hadn't anticipated that whatever it took would mean stepping into the lion's den of Blake's pharmacy. The walk to the store felt longer than usual that night. With each step, Alma replayed her plan in her mind. She would be polite. She would appeal to Blake's decency, if he had any. She wasn't asking for charity, only what was fair. As she approached the store, the neatly painted sign and bright windows seemed almost mocking, a beacon of prosperity in a town that left people like her behind. The building loomed large and imposing, and Alma felt as though every passerby's eyes were on her, judging her audacity. Inside, after Mr. Blake's rejection and the venom in his words, something inside Alma broke open. The years of quiet submission, of accepting her lot in life, suddenly collided with the unbearable weight of being denied the one thing her son needed to survive. Her hands had trembled, not with fear, but with suppressed rage, yet she had left, humiliated, powerless, and choking on unshed tears. As Alma made her way home that evening, her mind raced. She thought about how much she had endured over the years, the insults muttered under breaths as she walked through the market, the way shopkeepers would hesitate to touch her hand when giving her change, and the refusal of jobs she was more than qualified for. But this was a line crossed. She thought of James, her sweet boy who loved to read under the shade of the big oak tree in their yard, who dreamed of becoming a teacher despite the odds stacked against him. She couldn't let this stand. By the time she reached her modest home, Alma's tears had dried, replaced by a simmering determination. Her neighbor Clara Bell was waiting. As promised, having stayed with James while Alma went to the pharmacy. When Alma told her what had happened, Clara's face twisted with anger. "That man's a devil, Alma," Clara said, pacing the small room. "I've heard of him turning away folks before. But this is a crime. It doesn't matter what it is," Alma replied, her voice low and tired. "What matters is that James doesn't have the medicine he needs." Clara stopped pacing and turned to Alma, her hands on her hips. "You're not alone in this. Do you hear me? You're not alone." The next morning, true to her word, Clara brought help. Ms. Clara Richards, a fiery woman with a sharp mind and a louder voice, was known for her work in the civil rights movement. Alma had heard whispers about her, a troublemaker, some said, but others called her a savior. She arrived on Alma's porch with a clipboard, a briefcase, and a steely resolve. "Mrs. Jackson," Clara Richards began, after hearing the story, "what happened to you is illegal and immoral. We're not just going to let this slide." Alma hesitated, unsure. "I don't want trouble," she said. "I just want the medicine for James. And you deserve that medicine," Richards replied, her tone softening. "But if we don't fight this, it won't stop with you. It won't stop with James. Mr. Blake will keep doing this to anyone he thinks he can get away with it. You don't have to do this alone. I'll stand with you. We all will." Over the next few days, Alma's house became a hub of activity. Clara Richards mobilized others in the community, gathering testimonies from people who had also been mistreated at Blake's pharmacy. Some were afraid to come forward, but others spoke out, their stories forming a damning pattern of discrimination. Word spread quickly, and the town began to buzz with tension. Some in the black community rallied behind Alma, their anger and frustration finally given a voice. Others warned her to be cautious, fearing retaliation. Even within the white community, reactions were mixed. A few progressive voices quietly supported Alma, but most stood by Blake, defending him as a pillar of the community. Meanwhile, Alma wrestled with doubt. Every night, as she sat by James's bed, she questioned whether she was doing the right thing. She feared for her son's health, her family's safety, and her own sanity. Yet every time she looked at James, her resolve hardened. One night, Clara Richards brought over Anthony Hill, a young, ambitious lawyer who had recently moved to Pinewood to help fight racial injustice. He was calm and deliberate, with a quiet confidence that reassured Alma. "Mrs. Jackson," he said after introducing himself, "this won't be easy. Blake has power, connections, and money, but what he did was wrong, and the law is on your side. If you're willing to fight, I'll make sure we fight smart." Alma nodded, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I'm ready." The next morning, Alma's quiet resolve was put to the test. As she walked to the market, she could feel the stares and hear the whispers. One woman muttered loudly enough for Alma to hear, "She's stirring up trouble for all of us." Alma kept her head high, but the weight of the scrutiny was heavy. She knew the fight ahead would not only be for James but for everyone who had suffered under the crushing weight of prejudice. That evening, as she sat by James's bedside, holding his small, frail hand, she whispered, "Mama's gonna fix this, baby, I promise you, no matter what it takes." The morning was unusually quiet in Pinewood, the air thick with a tension that seemed to ripple through the town like an unspoken secret. News of Alma Jackson's decision to pursue legal action against Edward Blake had spread like wildfire. For some, her defiance was an act of courage, a long overdue challenge to the town's unspoken but deeply entrenched racial hierarchy. For others, it was a dangerous provocation, a move that threatened to upset the fragile balance of power. Alma had spent the night awake, alternating between moments of steely determination and waves of doubt. The sound of James's labored breathing punctuated her thoughts, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Her son's condition had stabilized slightly, thanks to an emergency supply of medicine that Clara Richards had procured through connections in a neighboring town. But Alma knew this wasn't just about James anymore. This was about justice, about standing up to years of humiliation and inequality. The day after Alma agreed to pursue the case, her small home became a hub of activity. Anthony Hill, the young lawyer with a calm demeanor and sharp intellect, began laying the groundwork for the legal battle ahead. He had set up a makeshift office in Alma's dining room. Papers and legal texts spread across the worn table. "This won't be easy," Anthony said, looking up from his notes as Alma poured coffee into two chipped mugs. "Blake's been in this town for decades. He has money, influence, and plenty of people who will back him up." Alma placed the mug in front of him and sat down, her hands folded tightly. "I don't care how hard it is," she said. "I won't let him get away with what he did, not to James. Not to anyone else." Anthony nodded, a faint smile breaking through his usually serious expression. "Good, that's the spirit we'll need." Clara Richards arrived shortly after, her clipboard in hand and her voice as commanding as ever. "We've got a lot of work to do," she announced, her words more a rallying cry than a statement. "Anthony, what's our first step?" Anthony leaned back in his chair, his mind already turning over the strategy. "First, we need witnesses, people who've experienced Blake's discrimination firsthand. Their stories will help establish a pattern of behavior. Second, we need to gather community support. The more public pressure we can build, the harder it will be for the court to ignore us." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Clara took charge of mobilizing the community, going door to door to gather testimonies. Some people were eager to share their experiences, their anger and frustration pouring out in vivid detail. Others were hesitant, fearful of retaliation or skeptical that the system would deliver justice. One of the first witnesses to come forward was Henry Carter, a local mechanic whose wife had been denied service at Blake's pharmacy the previous year. She was pregnant, Henry recalled, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain. She needed medicine for the baby. And he just turned her away. Said he didn't serve our kind. I had to drive 2 towns over to get what she needed. Henry's testimony was powerful, but it was also a stark reminder of the fear that gripped the community. "You sure this is gonna make a difference?" he asked. His skepticism evident. "It will," Clara Richards assured him, "but only if we all stand together." Meanwhile, Anthony began crafting the legal case with meticulous precision. He spent hours reviewing civil rights legislation, poring over similar cases, and strategizing how to present the evidence in a way that would resonate with the jury. Alma marveled at his dedication, often finding him still working late into the night, his brow furrowed in concentration. One evening, as Alma sat across from Anthony at the dining room table, she asked, "Why are you doing this? You're young, smart, you could be in some big city, making a lot of money. Why fight this fight here?" Anthony looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Because it matters," he said simply. "Because people like Blake think they can get away with this forever. And because people like you and James deserve better." As the case began to gain traction, tensions in Pinewood escalated. Supporters of Alma's cause organized peaceful demonstrations, gathering outside the courthouse with signs that read, "Justice for Alma Jackson and no more hate in Pinewood." The demonstrations were met with hostility from some members of the white community, who saw the movement as an attack on their way of life. Heated arguments broke out in the streets, and rumors of threats against Alma began to circulate. One night, Alma woke to the sound of rocks hitting her window. She peered outside to see a group of young men laughing as they sped away in a pickup truck. The word traitor scrawled in crude letters across her fence. Clara Richards arrived within minutes, her presence both comforting and defiant. "They're scared," Clara said, inspecting the damage. "They see their world changing, and they're lashing out, but we won't back down." The courtroom itself became a battleground. The trial, which drew crowds from across Pinewood and beyond, was a spectacle. On one side stood Anthony Hill, calm and composed as he presented a meticulous case built on testimony, legal precedent, and the sheer moral weight of Alma's story. On the other side was Robert Hayes, a seasoned defense attorney hired by Edward Blake, whose strategy relied heavily on discrediting the witnesses and painting Alma's actions as an overreaction. The testimony was gripping. Witnesses like Henry Carter shared their experiences with raw emotion, their words painting a damning picture of Blake's long history of discrimination. But the most powerful moment came when Alma took the stand. She recounted her experience with a quiet strength, her voice steady even as she described the humiliation and helplessness she had felt that night. "Why didn't you just leave and go to another pharmacy?" Hayes asked during cross-examination, his tone dismissive. Alma looked him in the eye, her voice firm. "Because my son needed that medicine, and I had the right to get it, just like anyone else." Her words hung in the air, a quiet but unshakable declaration of her humanity. Outside the courthouse, the demonstrations continued, growing larger with each passing day. The case had attracted national attention, with journalists and activists descending on Pinewood to document what many saw as a pivotal moment in the fight for civil rights. For Alma, the spotlight was both a source of strength and a burden. She hadn't sought fame, she had only wanted justice for James. But now, she carried the hopes of an entire community on her shoulders. As the trial entered its final days, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Anthony's closing argument was a masterful blend of logic and emotion, a passionate plea for justice that left many in the audience visibly moved. "This isn't just about Alma Jackson," he said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "It's about who we are as a society. It's about whether we will allow hatred and prejudice to dictate who gets to live and who gets to suffer." When the jury retired to deliberate, Alma sat quietly in the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She thought of James, of the nights she had spent praying by his bedside, and of the people who had stood by her when she felt like giving up. Whatever the outcome, she knew she had done everything she could. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with townspeople and reporters from neighboring counties, all craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the trial that had turned Pinewood into the center of attention. Outside, a crowd gathered with signs, some reading "Justice for Alma Jackson," others displaying angry slogans of resistance against what they called unnecessary disruption. The division in the town had never been more palpable. For Alma, sitting at the plaintiff's table alongside Anthony Hill, it was surreal. She had never imagined herself in such a place, fighting publicly. Not just for her son's rights but for the dignity of her entire community. Her hands rested in her lap, folded tightly, her knuckles pale, though her face remained calm. Her heart thundered. This was it, the moment where words could turn into justice, or yet another disappointment. The case began with Anthony's opening statement, a speech so steady and deliberate that it silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Anthony began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "This case is not just about a woman being denied service. It is about the fundamental principle that every person, regardless of the color of their skin, is entitled to dignity, respect, and equal treatment under the law." He turned toward the jury, his eyes locking onto theirs. What happened to Mrs. Alma Jackson wasn't an isolated incident. It was a calculated act of discrimination that put her son's life in danger. And today, we have the chance to send a message that no one is above the law, and that justice cannot be denied. The first witnesses Anthony called were members of the black community who had experienced similar treatment at Blake's pharmacy. Henry Carter, the mechanic whose pregnant wife had been denied service, took the stand first. His voice trembled as he spoke, recounting the fear and desperation he had felt that day. "She was 8 months along," Henry said, looking at the jury. "She was in pain, and the doctor said she needed that prescription right away. But Blake, he just stood there and said, 'We don't serve your kind.'" I'll never forget those words. Never. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Henry's words pressing down on everyone. Even Edward Blake, seated at the defense table, shifted uncomfortably, though his lawyer leaned over and whispered something in his ear, likely reminding him to keep his composure. But the defense was ready. During cross-examination, Robert Hayes, Blake's attorney, attempted to discredit Henry. "Mr. Carter," Hayes said, pacing before the witness stand, "isn't it true that you could have gone to another pharmacy? That no one forced you to rely on Mr. Blake's store?" Henry's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "We didn't have time to drive to another pharmacy. And why should we have to? It's the only one in town." Hayes smirked. "So, you're saying you expected Mr. Blake to risk his business reputation to serve someone he didn't want to serve?" The question drew murmurs from the crowd. But Henry didn't falter. "I'm saying he had a duty as a pharmacist to help people, no matter who they are." As the trial progressed, Anthony worked tirelessly to build the case. He called witness after witness, each adding another piece to the puzzle of Edward Blake's long history of discrimination. A young schoolteacher testified about being forced to wait until all the white customers were served before Blake begrudgingly filled her prescription. An elderly man spoke of being charged double the listed price for medicine he desperately needed. Each story painted a vivid picture of a man who had wielded his power not as a healer, but as a gatekeeper, deciding who was worthy of care and who was not. Alma, sitting silently at the plaintiff's table, felt a swell of emotion with every testimony. These were her neighbors, her friends, her community. Their stories mirrored her own pain, and together, they formed an undeniable pattern. Still, she couldn't shake the fear that it might not be enough. The defense strategy became clear as the trial continued: cast doubt on the plaintiff's stories, emphasize Blake's reputation as a businessman, and frame the lawsuit as an overreaction. Robert Hayes argued that Blake had the right to refuse service based on his personal beliefs and that Alma could have simply gone elsewhere. "Mrs. Jackson," Hayes said during his cross-examination, his tone condescending, "why didn't you just leave and go to another pharmacy? Surely you could have found someone else to help you." Alma's hands tightened into fists under the table, but she kept her voice steady as she responded. "Because my son was sick," she said. "He didn't have time for me to go somewhere else. And because I had the right to be there, just like anyone else." Hayes smirked, turning to the jury as if her words had proven his point. "A right," he repeated, as though the very concept were absurd. And yet, here we are, wasting the court's time over a disagreement about a single transaction. The turning point in the trial came when Anthony presented a surprise piece of evidence: a copy of a letter written by Edward Blake himself, uncovered by Clara Richards during her relentless research. The letter, addressed to a supplier, explicitly stated that Blake refused to serve black customers because he believed it would tarnish the reputation of his pharmacy. This letter, Anthony said, holding it up for the jury to see, is not just proof of Edward Blake's actions, it's proof of his intent. It shows that his refusal to serve Mrs. Jackson wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate decision rooted in prejudice. The courtroom erupted into whispers, the weight of the evidence sending shockwaves through the crowd. Even Hayes looked shaken, his confident demeanor faltering as he scrambled to address the revelation. As the trial drew to a close, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Anthony's closing argument was a powerful plea for justice. "This case is about more than a prescription," he said, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "It's about the values we claim to uphold as a society. It's about whether we believe that every person, regardless of their skin color, has the right to be treated with dignity and respect." Mrs. Jackson didn't ask for special treatment. She asked for what any mother would: a chance to save her child. And Edward Blake denied her that chance, not because he couldn't help her, but because he wouldn't. When the jury retired to deliberate, Alma felt the weight of the entire town's gaze on her. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled, their chants echoing through the streets. Some called for justice, their voices filled with hope. Others shouted insults, their anger boiling over into threats. As the hours dragged on, Alma sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She thought of James, of the nights she had spent by his bedside, and of the faces of the people who had shared their stories in court. Whatever the verdict, she knew she had done the right thing. She had stood up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been told they were less than. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman rose, the paper trembling in his hands as he prepared to deliver the verdict. Alma held her breath, her heart pounding as she braced herself for what was to come. The courtroom was silent. A stillness so complete that Alma could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The jury foreman, an older man with a lined face that betrayed no emotion, rose slowly, holding a slip of paper in trembling hands. Alma sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands gripping the edge as if the solid wood could anchor her amidst the swirling tide of emotions. On the defense side, Edward Blake sat stiffly, his attorney leaning in close, whispering what Alma could only imagine were reassurances. Blake's face was a mask of indifference. But Alma had seen that look before. It was fear, disguised as arrogance. The foreman cleared his throat. "In the case of Jackson versus Blake's Pharmacy, we find the defendant, Edward Blake, guilty of violating civil rights laws by denying service on the basis of race." For a moment, there was no reaction, as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath. Then a murmur began to ripple through the crowd, growing louder until it swelled into a cacophony of voices, some jubilant, others outraged. Alma exhaled sharply, a rush of relief and disbelief washing over her. Her attorney, Anthony Hill, turned to her with a small, triumphant smile. "It's not just about this room," Anthony said quietly, his words meant for Alma alone amidst the noise. "It's about what happens next. The aftermath of the verdict." Outside the courthouse, the crowd was in chaos. Supporters of Alma's case cheered and embraced one another, their voices filling the air with cries of victory and hope. On the other side of the steps, a smaller but louder group shouted angrily, their faces twisted in fury. Alma stepped out into the sunlight, flanked by Anthony and Clara Richards, her head held high despite the exhaustion that weighed on her. Reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras thrust into her face. "Mrs. Jackson, how do you feel about the verdict?" one shouted. "Do you think this case will change anything for Pinewood?" asked another. Alma paused, her hand trembling as she raised it slightly to silence the crowd. She wasn't used to speaking in front of so many people, but the words came from somewhere deep inside her, steady and clear. "I didn't do this just for me," she said. "I did it for my son, for my neighbors, for everyone who's ever been told they don't matter. This isn't just about one case. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter how hard it is." Her words were met with a swell of applause from her supporters. But Alma knew the fight wasn't over. This was a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning. The penalties for Edward Blake. The court's decision didn't just end with a guilty verdict. The judge ordered Blake to pay a hefty fine. The funds allocated to a local civil rights organization that would provide resources for victims of discrimination. Perhaps most significantly, Blake's license to operate as a pharmacist was permanently revoked. His store, once a symbol of his power, now stood as a hollow shell. Its neon sign darkened and its windows shuttered. Blake himself became a pariah in Pinewood. Former friends and supporters distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a man so publicly disgraced. For Alma, it was a small but satisfying justice to see the man who had wielded his power so cruelly brought low. The ripple effects in Pinewood. The case sent shockwaves through the town. For the Black community, it was a beacon of hope, proof that change was possible. Even in a place as deeply rooted in segregation as Pinewood, Alma became an unlikely figurehead for a growing movement. Her quiet strength inspiring others to speak out. Clara Richards seized the momentum, organizing town hall meetings and workshops to educate the community about their rights. The local church became a center for activism, its pews filled with people eager to be part of the change. Clara often pointed to Alma as an example during these gatherings. "She's a reminder," Clara said during one meeting, her voice carrying through the packed room. "That one person's courage can light the way for others." But not everyone welcomed the change. Tensions in Pinewood escalated, with acts of vandalism and intimidation aimed at those who supported the movement. Alma's home was targeted again, her fence defaced with hateful messages. Yet she refused to be intimidated. Her community rallied around her, neighbors taking turns standing guard outside her house at night. A personal victory for Alma. For Alma, the most profound victory was at home. James, her son, began to recover, his strength slowly returning with each passing day. One evening, as Alma sat by his bedside reading aloud from one of his favorite books, he reached out and took her hand. "You're so brave, Mama," he said, his voice still weak but filled with admiration. "You didn't give up." Alma smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I did it for you," she whispered, "so you can grow up in a world that's better than this one." That night, for the first time in months, Alma slept peacefully, knowing she had done everything in her power to protect her son and pave the way for a brighter future. Beyond Pinewood, a national impact. The case drew national attention, becoming a symbol of the broader civil rights movement. Newspapers ran headlines proclaiming Alma Jackson's victory, and her story was shared in churches, schools, and homes across the country. Letters poured in from people who had been inspired by her courage, some sharing their own stories of discrimination and resilience. Civil rights leaders reached out to Anthony and Clara, eager to replicate the strategies used in Alma's case in other towns. For Anthony, it was a validation of his work, but he remained humble. "This wasn't about me," he said during an interview. "This was about Mrs. Jackson and the countless others who face these injustices every day. They're the real heroes." Alma's reflection. Months after the trial, Alma stood on the steps of the courthouse once more, this time addressing a gathering of students from a newly desegregated school. She spoke of her journey, of the fear and doubt she had faced, and of the power of standing up for what is right. "I never thought I'd be here," she said, her voice steady. "I'm just a mother who wanted to save her child. But sometimes, it takes ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And if I can do it, so can you." Her words were met with applause, the faces of the young students glowing with hope. Alma knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time, she truly believed in the possibility of change. A legacy of courage. Alma's case became a landmark moment in Pinewood's history, a turning point that forced the town to confront its own prejudices and begin the slow process of healing. For Alma, it was never about fame or recognition. It was about ensuring that no other mother would have to endure what she had. As she walked home that evening, the sun setting behind her, Alma felt a quiet peace. She had stood up against hatred and won, not just for herself, but for her son and for everyone who believed in a better world. The fight wasn't over, but she knew she had sparked something powerful, something that would live on long after her. The verdict marked a moment of triumph, but it also lit a fuse beneath the long simmering tensions in Pinewood. As Alma sat in the courtroom after the decision was read, she felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The sound of cheers from her supporters outside reached her ears, mingling with angry murmurs from Blake's defenders. Alma knew the battle wasn't truly over, it was shifting into a new phase. one that would test her strength in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The fallout. In the days following the trial, Pinewood was a town transformed. The once quiet streets were now alive with heated debates in diners, on porches, and in church pews. Supporters of Alma's case celebrated the victory as a watershed moment, a strike against the entrenched racism that had defined their lives for generations. For others, it was an unwelcome disruption, a challenge to the status quo they clung to fiercely. Alma's name was on everyone's lips. Some spoke it with reverence, calling her a hero. Others spat it out like a curse, blaming her for the rising tension in the community. Blake's supporters, though fewer than before, were vocal and emboldened by their anger. They staged protests outside the shuttered pharmacy, holding signs that read "Save our town" and "No outsiders in Pinewood." One evening, Alma returned home to find a threatening note nailed to her door. The message, scrawled in red paint, read, "You'll regret this." Clara Richards, who had been staying with Alma to offer support, immediately called Anthony Hill. Within an hour, the young lawyer arrived with members of the local civil rights group. "This is just fear talking," Anthony said, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the gathered group. "They know things are changing, and they're trying to scare us into stopping. But we won't stop. Not now. Not ever." The group began organizing a community patrol, volunteers taking shifts to keep watch over Alma's home and other key locations in the Black neighborhood. It was a display of solidarity that reassured Alma. But the tension in the air was undeniable. Edward Blake's downfall. The penalties against Edward Blake were swift and severe. The hefty fine levied against him forced him to sell his pharmacy, a move that symbolized his fall from grace. His pharmacy, once a bustling hub of activity, now stood empty, its windows boarded up and its iconic neon sign removed. Blake himself became a pariah. The verdict had exposed not only his actions but the deep-seated prejudice he had tried to keep hidden behind a veneer of respectability. Former friends and business partners avoided him, unwilling to risk their reputations by associating with him. Even his staunchest supporters began to waver, realizing that defending him came at too high a social cost. Yet Blake's bitterness only deepened. Rumors swirled that he had retreated to a relative's house in a neighboring county, where he spent his days brooding and plotting his return. Alma, however, refused to let fear of retaliation consume her. She focused instead on the opportunities that the case had created, a spark for change. The victory in court sent ripples far beyond Pinewood. Civil rights activists across the state seized on the case as a powerful example of what could be achieved through persistence and courage. Alma was invited to speak at rallies and town hall meetings, her quiet but resolute voice inspiring others to take a stand. At one such rally, held in a nearby town, Alma stood before a crowd of hundreds. The faces before her were a mix of hope and weariness. People who had endured lifetimes of indignities and were yearning for change. "I didn't start this fight because I wanted to," Alma said, her voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "I started it because I had no choice. My son was sick, and I was tired of being told that my family didn't matter. But this isn't just about me or James. It's about all of us. It's about saying enough to the hate and the fear. And if I can stand up, so can you." The crowd erupted into applause, and Alma felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. She realized that her fight had become something much larger than herself, a movement that would continue to grow. Long after she was gone, resistance and courage. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some in Pinewood doubled down on their efforts to maintain segregation, using threats and intimidation to try to silence those who dared to challenge the old ways. Clara Richards became a frequent target, receiving anonymous phone calls and finding graffiti sprayed on the community center she had established. Yet she remained undeterred. "They're afraid because they know they're losing," Clara told Alma one evening as they sat together on Alma's porch. "And they should be. Change is coming, whether they like it or not." The threats escalated in the weeks following the trial. One night, a group of masked men attempted to set fire to the community center. But the quick actions of the neighborhood patrol thwarted their plans. The incident only strengthened the resolve of the community, who turned out in record numbers for the next rally, determined to show that they would not be intimidated. A personal triumph. Through it all, Alma found strength in her son, James. His health had improved steadily since the trial, and he was regaining the bright, curious energy that had always defined him. One afternoon, as Alma watched him playing in the yard with a group of neighborhood children, she felt a deep sense of peace. James ran over to her, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, can I be like Mr. Anthony when I grow up?" he asked. His eyes shining. Alma smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You can be anything you want to be, baby," she said, "and don't let anyone tell you different." A legacy of hope. As the months turned into years, Alma's case became a cornerstone of Pinewood's slow but steady transformation. Schools began to integrate. Businesses that once enforced segregation quietly abandoned the practice. And younger generations began to question the prejudices they had been raised with. Alma herself remained a pillar of the community, a source of wisdom and guidance for those who sought her out. She rarely spoke of the trial, preferring to focus on the future. But its impact was evident in everything she did. One evening, as Alma walked home from a meeting at the church, she paused at the old pharmacy building. It was still empty, its once bright exterior now faded and worn. Alma stood there for a long moment, reflecting on how much had changed, and how much work still lay ahead. As she turned to leave, she whispered to herself, "We're not done yet." And with that, she walked into the twilight, her steps steady, her heart full of hope.